Greg Cook could have been the greatest quarterback to ever play the game, but don't take my word for it. Bill Walsh, the man who coached Joe Montana and Steve Young, would say Cook was the most talented player there was. That right there is enough to make you pause and be like, that guy must have been the real deal. Legendary coach Paul Brown would echo a similar sentiment.
I know Paul Brown thought he was one of the greatest players ever as well.
So many people speak highly of Greg Cook, but what made him so good? And why don't we really hear about him? Following Cook's death in 2012, Bengals owner Mike Brown said, Greg Cook was the single greatest talent we have ever had here. Sam Weish, former Bengals head coach and backup to Cook, said, I think Greg Cook would have been mentioned, had he had a full career, with the greatest quarterbacks in the history of the league.
Joe and Greg had the same potential when they first started out.
Okay, so why? Well, he had an immediate impact for the team, who were only in their second year of existence. He had a strong arm, he was fast, and he was accurate. He would throw his players open, the defense would cover it perfectly, but he'd find a way to dissect it. A former teammate said he was a big, strapping gunslinger, and the most important thing when you play quarterback is accuracy. And he was accurate. I mean, he could put it on a dime, and he was particularly accurate going deep. A combination of the size and strength of Terry Bradshaw and the instincts of Joe Montana, as the New York Times put it. And he had his own style, which worked. For example, you're coached to have two hands on the ball, but great players don't fit perfectly into a mold of what we're told a player should be like. When I heard this, Brett Favre and Aaron Rodgers with their feet coming off the ground comes to mind. You're supposed to have your feet planted. These guys didn't, and they thrived with those types of throws. Even Paul Brown, notorious tough guy, old school, bent to Cook's will, allowing him to change up plays every so often.
If Greg had remained healthy, Paul would have changed. Paul would have let Greg Cook do what he wanted to because of just the unbelievable, beautiful talent of a kid like Greg Cook.
In Cook's final year of college, he threw for 3,372 yards and 25 touchdowns. He had 8 straight 250-yard games. This is in 1969, where the run game was far more dominant. He threw for 554 yards against Ohio, a single game record for the University of Cincinnati. He also had a 98-yard touchdown pass against Louisville, which is also a school record. Despite his great year, the team sat at 4-4. In the final game of the season, they were down 14-0 against Miami University in the fourth quarter. Cook started to get into his rhythm late, and he went for 263 yards and 3 touchdowns in one quarter. His late game heroics managed to give them a victory with a game-winning field goal. The Bengals head coach, Paul Brown, was watching that game, and after that, he knew who he was drafting, selecting Cook 5th overall in the 1969 draft. Cook was so good, he was almost instantly named the starter. He won the role in his first training camp session. The Bengals would win their first 3 games with Cook at the helm, but an injury against the Chiefs would derail his career. After week 3, he would miss the next 4 games, and the Bengals would lose them all, and then he'd return in week 8 to beat the Raiders, but following that, the Bengals wouldn't win another game, tying 1 and losing the rest. The Bengals would hobble to a 4-9-1 record. So the injury. Playing against the Chiefs, Cook was tackled by linebacker Jim Lynch, who fell on Cook's shoulder. It was a clean tackle, but a devastating result. He had a torn rotator cuff, but it went undiagnosed. There were limits to sports medicine back then, so they just injected him with cortisone to manage the pain, and he played through it. He did not get proper treatment. But Cook himself would say this.
Went in to see an orthopedic surgeon here in Cincinnati, and he looked at it and in about 2 minutes determined that it was a rotator cuff injury.
So that kind of confuses me. If he goes to an orthopedic and they tell him within 2 minutes, wouldn't the doctors of the Bengals know? Regardless, he played through the season with this injury, and that resulted in the rotator cuff and the shoulder deteriorating. He received surgery in the off-season, but at that point they also found his bicep was partially detached. So after multiple surgeries, it was clear his career was over. He played in 1 game for the Bengals in 1973 and only threw 3 passes. Despite the injury, he finished his rookie season with 1,854 yards, 15 touchdowns, and 11 interceptions. He'd win the AFL passing title and Offensive Rookie of the Year. He'd average 9.41 yards per pass attempt and 17.5 yards per completion, which are rookie records that still stand today. There wasn't just the physical breakdown, but also the mental side of it. He knew his talent, and no longer being able to play had a massive impact on him. It's like he knew how great he was, but he was never able to fulfill the potential he had. Football was his creative outlet, and once he lost that, it seems he lost himself.
Greg was a highly sensitive person, not totally stable from the standpoint of being able to deal with adversity. Consequently, it affected him, I think, a little bit psychologically.
Greg Cook is the greatest what-if player. and the game would have been very different if Cook was healthy. Bill Walsh developed a scheme around the strengths of Cook's replacement, Virgil Carter. It would be the birth of the West Coast offense. But if Cook was there, the scheme would have looked a lot different. Carter didn't excel in the deep throw, Cook did. So does that mean no 49ers dynasty, no Joe Montana? Bill Walsh himself said that the system would have been completely different. It would have started with the deep strike and everything would have played off that. So not only do we have this what if about the individual's career, but also NFL history itself. That being said, in terms of team success, when Paul Brown moved to the front office of the Bengals, he chose not to hire Walsh as a head coach. Brown believed Walsh was not mentally tough enough for the position, and he also gave numerous bad reviews about Walsh, hindering his chance of a job elsewhere. But after the 49ers were purchased by the DeBartolo family, they'd hire Walsh, and the rest is history. So there's also the question of what would the NFL look like if the Bengals, not the 49ers, retained Bill Walsh. Unfortunately, we'll never know if Cook would have been the greatest. An unfortunate injury that ended a possibly all-time great career. His skill set was timeless. As Bill Walsh said, he could have been great in any era. Alright, thanks for watching.